What if the army that defeated the Nazis wasn't real? This is the story of the Ghost Army, an elite special ops unit made up of American artists, actors, and sound engineers who fought in World War II by making the impossible sound real. As the Allied forces moved across Europe towards Germany, they had to cross a river. It was guarded by some of the most heavily armed Nazi defenses, including landmines, machine gun nests, and enough explosives to blow any attacking force to smithereens. But no one was coming. From April to May 1945, while Allied commanders planned a full-scale assault, a secret team of soldiers did something far more audacious than crossing the Rhine River under heavy fire. They crossed it under cover of darkness, and without the Germans even realizing anyone was there. And they accomplished this feat not with guns or tanks, but with inflatable rubber decoys and recordings of marching soldiers. It all started when the United States military realized it had a problem. As the war in Europe drew to a close, American soldiers were dying every day. In planning the final push into Nazi Germany, General George Patton wanted to liberate the Germans' Third Reich stronghold, but that meant crossing one of the most heavily fortified areas in Germany. The east bank of the Rhine was protected by 3 years of defensive works, including 26 major defensive lines, over 300 artillery positions, landmines, machine gun nests, mortars, grenades, anti-tank guns, and explosives. Given what they knew about German tenacity, the coming battle could be devastating. But it didn't have to be, not if someone could trick the enemy into thinking an attack was coming from somewhere else. Enter the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, a top-secret unit of around 800 soldiers hand-picked by the U.S. Army for their unique skills. Most were artists, actors, sound engineers, and set designers, men whose talents were better suited to the stage than the battlefield. The team was led by Lieutenant Colonel James Bunker, a former Broadway director and producer who organized troops into platoons named for different parts of a theater production, including a props, costume, scenery, and even a special effects platoon. The goal was to make a single massive special effect. In April 1945, the 23rd staged its first operation, creating the illusion that Allied troops were poised to cross the Rhine at several points along the river. Fake inflatable tanks were placed near the riverbank, which were then covered with camouflaging netting and branches. The next night, German planes flew overhead and dropped bombs, missing the decoys by only feet and exploding harmlessly in the water. Another night, inflatable boats filled with soldiers rowed out to the middle of the river and anchored there. The Germans fired on them too, each explosion driving another nail into the coffin of Operation Varsity, the real plan to cross the river. But the Ghost Army had one last trick left. On the third night, the sound platoon began to march. Armed with loudspeakers, amplifiers, and microphones, they marched back and forth along the riverbank, giving the impression of a large force readying itself to cross. Some soldiers shouted and yelled, pretending to direct the crossing. Others sang songs like "Onward to Victory." A few even practiced tank noises, and it worked. German command reported hearing sounds of a large force crossing the river. So convinced was the German high command that an attack was imminent that they pulled back their defenses from the supposed crossing point and reinforced those in other areas. While the 23rd HQST prepared for the invasion of France, the Ghost Army pulled off another daring deception, this time in Belgium. Here, 2 separate units came together for the first time. One group created lifelike inflatable tanks and trucks covered in netting and branches to resemble wrecked vehicles stuck in the mud. A second group of Ghost Army soldiers stood off to the side and blasted recordings of a large battle through loud speakers hidden in nearby buildings and trees. Once again, the ruse worked. German forces, believing a fierce fight to be happening just out of earshot, pulled back their patrols, leaving the villages undefended as American troops moved in. Deceptions like these became the norm for the Ghost Army. In March 1945, the team convinced the Germans that British troops had landed at the port of Antwerp. And in April, they fooled the Germans into thinking American soldiers were stationed in an area near Cologne, drawing German fire away from a key bridge that the Americans needed to cross. By the end of the war, the Ghost Army had saved thousands of American lives. Their largest deception was the liberation of the town of LeMay. In mid-April, the 23rd HCS arrived in LeMay to find it defended by nearly 500 German soldiers armed with mortars, machine guns, artillery pieces, and plenty of explosives. To liberate the town without casualties, the Ghost Army would need to deceive the Germans into thinking the entire First Army was advancing on them from two directions. It was the biggest operation the 23rd had attempted, and to pull it off, they would have to start from scratch. A small detachment of artists spent several days creating 21 inflatable replicas of Sherman tanks, complete with mud splatter, fake bullet holes, and realistic markings. To make the operation believable, the rest of the Ghost Army set up 2 inflatable command posts, a field hospital, supply depots, machine gun emplacements, and even fake barbed wire fences. Then they moved to the edge of town and began broadcasting recordings of tanks moving through the streets, followed by the sounds of battle. The plan called for the decoys to be set up around noon on April 12th, with the audio effects beginning at 3 p.m. But storms rolled in and forced the team to wait until the next day. That gave the Germans time to spot the decoys before nightfall. So when the storm finally passed, the Ghost Army used its sound effects to create a diversion, drawing German attention away from the main force. Then as soon as the coast was clear, dozens of American soldiers moved into the town, securing it without a single casualty. In all, the 23rd HCS pulled off 17 similar operations during the war, regularly deceiving the Germans into thinking much larger forces were present than actually were. So secretive was this work that the team members weren't even allowed to discuss their missions with family members. Many didn't even tell their wives where they were being deployed. After the war ended, the Ghost Army returned home and quietly went their separate ways, leaving behind a legacy of creative deception. Most of the men were demobilized and returned to civilian life, although some stayed in the army, eventually becoming Hollywood special effects pioneers and working on classic films like Gone with the Wind and The Wizard of Oz. But the 23rd HCS never received official recognition for their service. It wasn't until 1996 that author Rick Beyer uncovered their story while researching the liberation of LeMay. In his book, The Ghost Army, he wrote that the men of the 23rd had been given a solemn oath to secrecy, one they kept until they were old and gray. Unfortunately, many of the men were dead by the time their story was uncovered, taking their tales of creative deception to their graves. But that doesn't mean the Ghost Army isn't still with us today. At Fort Belvoir, Virginia, the Defense Intelligence Agency has a small display dedicated to the 23rd, including a model of one of their inflatable tanks and a framed copy of Hitler's declaration of war. Across the hall, a plaque honors the men of the 23rd, calling them masters of disguise who use their talents to fool the enemy. It may not be much, but it's a reminder that sometimes illusions can win real battles.